Behind Me Dips Eternity is another poem typical of Emily Dickinson. She questions the nature of the afterlife, and rather than presenting it as some sort of royal, glorious kingdom to come, such as might be imagined by her Puritan community's faith, she in fact presents it as a threatening void, a chasm of meaninglessness. And as such, she's also exploring human life and, in fact, possibly her own identity as an insignificant interruption in an expanse of nothingness. There's a sense that she's reduced. Her life is very small and insignificant amongst the expanse of nothingness, a sort of brevity of human experience. Amongst these questions, there are also questions about the nature of death. She presents it as sort of a dissolving, a drift. And there's also, quite typical for Dickinson, an examination of some aspect of her faith. So here she examines the nature of the Holy Trinity, posing questions about the idea of one God in three persons. There's a sense of doubtfulness about this. So, let's look at the poem's first stanza. Now, the first thing to say is that eternity is often used in Emily Dickinson's poetry to mean a threatening void of nothingness, a chasm of meaninglessness, whereas we have immortality here, and this is more often used to refer to the Christian ideal of the afterlife. Dickinson starts her first two consecutive lines with prepositions. Behind me dips eternity, before me immortality. There's a sense that these big, abstract expanses of time, expanses of nothingness, expanses of uncertainty are surrounding her with these uses of prepositions. So we've got prepositions taking a very central place at the start of both lines. And she then goes on to write myself, the term between. So we have another preposition here, myself, the term between. So she uses these prepositions to create a sense of maybe powerlessness. She feels trapped. She's trapped between these two big abstract concepts, these two big unknowns, and also she creates a sense of insignificance. She is merely the term. So by calling herself the term, she might be referring to herself as a short moment or an interval. A term is a not very long length of time. So it's suggesting, again, human existence is rather brief and insignificant. It might also refer to a word or an expression, in which case this might be a bit of a witty reference to her work. Perhaps she's talking about maybe the feelings of her own writing and its insignificance. And it's a bit of a joke because the term is a term in the middle between it's in the middle of the sentence, so maybe she's having a bit of a witty joke. Term is also what we might call an address term, which means your name, an identity of an individual. So again, she's placing her as an individual amidst these overwhelming, sort of threatening nothingnesses, this eternity, this immortality, placing herself amongst these unknowns. So we can also get a sense that she feels perhaps reduced, not only by the fact that the term is a small length of time amidst these huge expanses of time, but also the fact that term is sort of monosyllabic compared to the polysyllabic words of eternity and immortality. Term is a very short monosyllabic word, so we might want to make a comment about that. We could also think about the way Dickinson's made herself or the sort of identity in this poem seem reduced by her use of metre. So, if we just make this bigger down here so you can see it. In the first two lines here, and here. She uses iambic tetrameter. So there's 4 iambs, 4 didums in each line. Behind me dips eternity. There's 4 didums. And before me immortality. 4 beats. However, this line, myself, the term between, only has 3 iambs. Whereas again, this line and this line have 4 iambs. So this line here is a metrically reduced line. And this word here should say reduced, not reused. A bit of a typo there. So let's move on to look at the next image or metaphor that Dickinson uses. She now turns to think about what death is, and she says, death but the drift of eastern grey dissolving into dawn away before the west begin. So she's using an image of dawn, the eastern grey dissolving into dawn. It's the start of the day. Death is being imagined, or she's using the metaphor of death as being the start of the day. And this is a bit confusing because it inverts the typical tropes of death. Normally, or typically death would be seen as the end of a day. There's sort of a sense of confusion with the trope, that the metaphor somehow seems a little bit inverted. Now, we can interpret this in several ways. Does this show some sense of uncertainty about the nature of death? What is it? Is it quite a nice, reassuring image? Death is the start of the day, something that there's definitely something more to come, a certainty that there is something more, and it's the beginning of a new day. Is that a nice, refreshing image? However, if we look at the fact that she calls it Eastern grey, grey is a colour that is not particularly vibrant or bright, which might suggest perhaps something uncertain, greyness and uncertainty. And we've got death is but the drift. Now, drift, again, is it a nice gentle word, an unthreatening word? Or drift, is it some sort of uncertainty, a lack of purpose? And similarly, we've got this present participle dissolving into dawn away. Is that a nice, gentle movement? Or is it a somehow slightly terrifying reduction to nothingness? If something dissolves, it turns into nothing. Or is there something quite nice with the fact that you dissolve into dawn? You become part of the world. There's a communion with nature, and this might reflect some sort of transcendental ideas. Transcendentalism thought that we could have some sort of communion with nature. So when we would write an essay about this, we might want to weigh up different interpretations. Is the metaphor gentle and lyrical, or dark and uncertain? Similarly, we have enjambment here. Death but the drift of eastern grey dissolving into dawn away. Whereas we have end-stopped lines, here, here, here. Here we have enjambment that carries on to this next line. And is this a nice sense of sort of continuation with the dissolving, that present participle? We get a sense of this sort of gentle continuation of life into death, this dissolve, this drift from life to death, gentleness with the enjambment. So we could think about what that means. Right, let's move on to the next stanza. The next stanza moves from what we might perceive as quite a lyrical, contemplative opening stanza to a much more sarcastic second stanza. She expresses scepticism about what the church says, and she also shows a distrust of the idea of the Holy Trinity. She starts the second stanza with "'Tis kingdoms afterward, they say." Now, she uses the sceptical "they say" pushed to the end of the line. So hyperbaton is when the word order isn't the kind of natural expected word, or it's been kind of played around with. So you'd expect the sentence to say, they say there's kingdoms afterwards, but instead the sceptical, doubtful verb, they say, has been pushed to the end to sort of to emphasise the scepticism. And perhaps there's a dismissive pronoun here, they say. Is she referring to preachers of the church? Is she referring to the much gesture from the pulpit that we had from This World Is Not Conclusion? And it's interesting if we think about the fact that whoever they is, perhaps the church or the preachers from the pulpit, they say it's kingdoms afterwards. Kingdoms has connotations of sort of a glorious land, a glorious reign, something regal, something royal. And this contrasts greatly with what Dickinson has been, or the ideas that Dickinson has been engaging with, the ideas that sort of death is a greyness, and sort of this emptiness, this eternity, this immortality. Here perhaps she is being questioning about her Puritan community's belief in the afterlife, belief in salvation and redemption. So she's being quite subversive here. And she continues this sort of subversive tone, and she says, in perfect pauseless monarchy. She suggests with her use of alliteration here, these sort of spitting plosive p sounds, that this idea of sort of pauses, that this never-ending reign, this kingdom, it is perhaps unrealistic or it's questionable. And again, she uses alliteration here, whose prince is son of none. She's, with the use of prince and son of none, she's referring to Jesus. And yet there's this question about the Holy Trinity. So this idea that within the Trinity there's one God in three persons, yet each is God whole and entire. I think she's raising the idea that this is a very confusing, abstract concept. It seems slightly illogical, and she uses the repetition of the pronoun himself, himself, himself 3 times, perhaps to represent the Trinity. And she then goes on to use an oxymoron or a paradox. She's drawing attention to the fact that the Trinity is 3 and yet 1 at the same time. He says she says himself diversify, which means kind of make different, make multiple, and yet duplicate, that means to kind of make the same. So she's drawing attention to that paradox, or that problem that she has with the concept of the Holy Trinity. What else can we say about this stanza? Perhaps the repetition of himself, himself, himself. Is it quite childish? Does she become slightly petty here? Is the himself, 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 that pronoun, does it suggest kind of a selfishness to God? Is this really quite subversive? Is it suggesting some sort of vanity, that the self-importance, himself, himself, himself? She's suggesting we're kind of sort of worshipping some sort of self-important figurehead. And we've got himself repeated at the start of 2 consecutive lines, so you can think about the use of anaphora, again suggesting that kind of repetition, suggesting either a pettiness or God's perhaps kind of self-importance. So let's move on from the examination of the Holy Trinity to the final stanza of this poem. I think this stanza continues, at least in the first couple of lines, to use a sceptical tone. I think she's being quite sceptical about the language of the church and the rhetoric of the church. In another poem, in This World Is Not Conclusion, she talks about the strong hallelujah's role, suggesting this sort of this boisterous rhetoric of the church, and I feel almost as though she's mimicking the diction, the language of the church. She says, "'Tis miracle before me then, 'tis miracle behind me then." Is she being sarcastic? She is certainly being doubtful about what the church is suggesting. Is it a miracle, or is it just this scary void of nothingness that is to come? And we see here that Dickinson is using once again prepositions to suggest this sense that she is surrounded. Her life is a small term surrounded by something before and after, some sort of miracle before and after. And in her last brief letter to her cousins, the day before she died, Dickinson states that she's been called back, which suggests that she views her life as an interruption in another life, presumably heaven. But we get that sense that, especially again with the repetition of between, we've seen between, that preposition earlier in stanza 1, that her life is sort of an interruption in something much greater than herself, something much grander. And again, we have a sense that she has been reduced. She says, "a crescent in the sea." She is referring to herself as a crescent in the sea. Is this a reflection of the moon in the sea? In which case, she's distanced. She is merely a reflection. She's transient. She's ephemeral. She doesn't really exist. She's just a reflection. And a crescent is just a sliver of a whole. It's a sliver of a sphere. And again, suggesting that she's been reduced. And we have, just like in the first stanza, that middle line, "a crescent in the sea," just like in the first stanza, myself return between. Metrically, it is a reduced line in comparison to the iambic tetrameter of the first two lines and the two lines coming after. This line here, "a crescent in the sea," is only iambic trimeter. Again, metrically showing that reduction. We also get a sense, or Dickinson portrays a sense, that the speaker feels reduced, or we're moving away from the speaker. She's becoming distanced. She is becoming effaced, because Dickinson shifts the pronouns from me, from first person here, to third person. Me makes us feel quite close to the speaker, whereas her is distancing us from her. There's a sense of the speaker's reduction, and her insignificance is increased. Now we have as well a movement towards something quite ominous at the end. Whereas you could argue that the image in the first stanza of the poem of the eastern grey dissolving into dawn away, you could argue that was quite gentle and lyrical, albeit maybe there are some darker undertones to that. This is definitely a much more threatening image to end the poem. She says there's midnight to the north of her and midnight to the south of her, and maelstrom in the sky. So the sense that she's surrounded by this sort of totality, midnight sort of at a time of darkness. She's surrounded by darkness, and there's a maelstrom in the sky, a sort of a threatening turmoil, chaos, disorder, confusion. And this really is a contrast to the poem's first stanza, where any darkness really was perhaps a subtext. It was kind of a greyness, and dissolving might have been slightly scary, but this really is something much more violent. And Dickinson uses anaphora here and here, the repetition of the same word at the start of consecutive lines, and midnight to the south of her, and maelstrom in the sky. The and creates a sense of overwhelmingness, a sense of sort of building up, a sense of accumulation. I think it ends more on a note of anxiety rather than the contemplative question of death dissolving away. This is much more violent and maybe overwhelming and confusing. Dickinson creates the sense of confusion with her juxtaposition of these prepositions behind, between. These two conflicting prepositions behind and between does create a sense of sort of confusion with her spatiality. I hope this has helped you understand some aspects of this poem a little bit better. Good luck with your own exploration of this poem, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.